Welcome back to the program. It's April 3rd, checking in on the insanity, the chaos, the fear and loathing that's going on around the country and the world over President Trump trying to do something about reversing our massive trade imbalance. What I'm not hearing is any other alternative solutions to the problem, because we have a serious, serious problem when it comes to trade. It all started in the 1970s during the Cold War in the Nixon administration and Henry Kissinger's brilliant idea to open up to China in order to strengthen China, to get China on our side to take on Russia. And then the additional idea that if we open up trade with China and democratize them, show them the joys and benefits of the market economy, free enterprise, they'll become a democracy and they'll be peaceful and kind. And of course, that blew up in our face, obviously, long ago. Even though we saw the failure of that policy in the 1980s and 90s, Bill Clinton and Republicans in Congress in 1999 passed permanent normal trade relations with China. They ascended to the WTO the next year, and the hollowing out of America's manufacturing was sped up. The winnowing away of America's middle class was sped up. 2024, we ran a $1.2 trillion trade deficit. Since 1974, we have, on a gross basis, sent over $43 trillion into the rest of the world. On a net basis, close to 30 trillion, maybe 29, $30 trillion on a net basis from our country to the rest of the world. We are the cause for why China has become our strategic foe, why China has become so strong, why China is willing to take over Taiwan and not worry about us, why China is building the Belt and Road Initiative. Our trade policy, as engineered by successive presidents and Congresses, has been a unilateral free trade policy driven by hubris and ego, arrogance, and we have the scars and the problems to prove it. The data is clear. The impact on manufacturing jobs is clear. Tens of millions of manufacturing jobs gone. Again, the hollowing out of the middle class. This is a serious, serious issue. And then it doesn't stop there. Consider now, trade deficits, by definition, result in loss of ownership of domestic assets to foreign nationals as well. Since the 1980s, driven by U.S. investment banks, U.S. American citizens working for U.S. investment banks, we have allowed tens and tens of thousands of our domestic-owned corporations and companies to be bought and controlled by foreign nationals. We have been picked over like a carcass on the road by a bunch of vultures. Most of the amazing brand names created in the last 100 years in America are now under the control of foreign ownership. All you have to do is look at our sports stadiums, look at commercials in the Super Bowl, look at downtown areas with strong amounts of advertising. You see nothing but foreign companies advertising. There is no painless solution to correcting this trade imbalance. And to do nothing is to neglect our responsibility to ourselves, our country, to national security, to the State of the Union. Tariffs and quotas are the primary tool used to correct trade imbalances. As we did for most of our history up until the 1920s and 30s, we ran a mercantilist system. Most of the rest of the world has been running a mercantilist system against us since the 1970s. And that basically means protecting domestic industry while maximizing exports. There's no denying that trade with the United States has been a critical part for the wealth creation of successive Asian countries, for most of Western Europe, for most countries that trade with America. And we can talk right from the beginning. We can go Germany, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, before it was given back to China, Thailand, now Vietnam, of course, China. India's in line to do the same thing. They all do what we did, and that is strong barriers to imports and working hard to maximize exports. And so what Donald Trump is doing, what President Trump is doing, has been something talked about for years by Republican candidates. No one had the courage to do it. There's always this example of the Smoot-Hawley Tariffs Act during the 1920s and 30s that has been blamed for the Great Depression, and that's simply not true. Trade in terms of imports and exports as a percent of the U.S. economy at that time was very small. Even today, when we're complaining about the massive amounts of imports and exports, we're still talking 13, 14, 15, 18% total trade in terms of percent of GDP. So no, that is not an appropriate corollary example of why tariffs are bad. The Wall Street Journal, Republican free traders, and of course Democrats, just because Donald Trump is doing it, are all opposing this. It's the Wall Street Journal. It's the Council on Foreign Relations. It's the Carlyle Group. It's the globalists who said that all this was good for America, that we would benefit, that the rest of the world would make cheap consumer goods and we would dominate in capital goods and advanced technology. Well, they've all been wrong. We have had the wrong trade policy for decades. We have negotiated bad trade policy for decades. We have been beaten at the negotiating table for decades. And one of the easy ways to understand this and see this is if you go and check trade relationships, trade arrangements we have put forth, and it's hard to do, it's not easy information to find. You will always find within the bills, not on the foreign side, but on America's side, Trade Assistance Authority. Every single example of us opening trade with a new country, South Korea is a good example of our most recent, Mexico, Vietnam. We always have in the legislation Trade Assistance Authority because the policymakers in America, the trade negotiation in America, members of Congress in America know that as soon as that new legislation, that new trade policy is enacted, Americans were going to lose their jobs. It's one of the best indicators we have that policymakers knew we would lose. And the Trade Assistance Authority was there to help for worker retraining, subsidizing unemployment, and anything else they could think of in order to mollify those who would lose their jobs as a result of trade policy. We have the scars to show bad trade policy all over the country. Now, if we go back to the 1960s and early 1970s, there was movement of large American corporations that had dominated the Northeast and the Illinois, Chicago, Indiana area. And there was a first move out of the Northeast, and that first move was to the South and to the West in the United States. And while that was difficult for the states that were losing that, I think of Pittsfield, Massachusetts is a wonderful example who lost General Electric. That was painful, but at least we kept the production, the capacity, the jobs in the United States. The next move, of course, was out of the United States. And then after the year 2000, when they passed permanent normal trade relations with China, and remember now, China negotiated a deal that said simply this: you want to sell to Chinese customers, you have to make your stuff in China. Now, Trump is saying the same thing today, and all of a sudden the world is freaking out. And every other country has said that. And so bad trade policy through successive presidents, members of Congress, has resulted in a massive, massive trade imbalance and serious damage to the U.S. economy. This effort of reshoring all these types of jobs, this type of manufacturing, we used to do it. We let it leave, and now we're fighting to bring it back. Talk about failure, talk about inefficiency, talk about waste of capital. It became less expensive to make something in China, even central China, some cheap consumer good, ship it to the coastline, put it on a boat, send it across the Pacific, and then send it throughout the United States. These trade imbalances were driven by massive differences in production costs, driven largely by labor costs. And it's got to stop. And it's stopping. And it's going to be messy. And it's going to hurt. American companies will be hurt. American consumers will be hurt. Now, the idea of tariffs is to increase the price of imports, force the domestic consumer to substitute now a cheaper domestic good. And that will be the case for many goods. But because of our trade policy was allowed to run for so long, there are many goods we simply don't make anymore. And so the idea of being able to find a domestic substitute is out the window. And so we talk about elasticity functions. We talk about sensitivity to pricing. Any of that results in consumers having relatively inelastic demand. That is to say, they're going to buy the foreign good anyway, regardless of the increase in price, or they will stop buying the foreign good. And so this will have potential impacts on increasing the price level, and so increasing rates of inflation. It will have impacts on GDP growth, likely to the downside, although it's not clear exactly to what degree, because we understand that We have the GDP equation, how we calculate gross domestic product, a measure of our growth. One of the best measures we have, although not perfect, is to add up personal consumption expenditures, gross private domestic investment, government spending, and net exports. And those four variables added together create GDP. And that last variable, net exports, is exports minus imports. And it's been negative for a very long time. And so you can just think of the simple math. If that were not negative, GDP would be higher. Now, there is some belief that that negative component that is net exports drags down GDP. But because of the cheap imports that come in, personal consumption expenditures, the C, rises. And so on net, there was some balancing there. But the net difference still was dominated by net exports. And the same can be true here. Which is to say, as net exports improves, okay, so the trade deficit improves, we get less deficit moving towards a balanced trade arrangement or even a trade surplus. That'll increase GDP. But again, some net impact will be found in a drop in C, personal consumption expenditures. And so we'll have to find how that weighs out. But what President Trump is doing is the appropriate policy for the problem we have put ourselves in on our own. And that is to say, American voters, American citizens are responsible for this. We vote these people into office. They make policy. We continue to vote them into office. And now finally, we have someone doing something about it. And the best way to manage this in terms of tariffs and quotas is reciprocity. I talked about this in 2013 in the book I published, the five structural barriers to American strength and prosperity. And I talked specifically about the importance of reciprocity. You do unto me as I do unto you. We know this from religious texts. For decades and decades and decades, economic theory has praised free trade, and yet free trade has never existed anywhere in the world. But in the textbook, in the classroom, at the Wall Street Journal, at the Federal Reserve, free trade is God. And free trade means no barriers to trade. Well, that simply hasn't been true, except for in the United States, where we had zero to no barriers to imports, while the rest of the world kept up barriers to our exports, and other countries' exports as well. And so reciprocity is the right way to go. You want us to take our tariffs away? You reduce your tariffs. It is an appropriate policy move. Reciprocity. We've been beat by Mexico and Canada in NAFTA. We were beat by China in permanent normal trade relations. We're being beat by Vietnam, South Korea. It just doesn't stop. American multinational corporations long ago decided to manufacture where they sell when it comes to foreign countries. Other large corporations did the opposite. You may recall in the 1980s when the big three were getting clobbered by the big five out of Japan, we arranged an agreement with Japan for something called voluntary export restraints that resulted in Japan agreeing to reduce the number of auto exports from Japan into the US. And what did this motivate? This motivated significant foreign direct investment by the Chinese Big Five into the US greenfields. We call it greenfield investment, such that Toyota, Honda, Mitsubishi, Subaru, Nissan began to make their cars in the United States. It was really they began to assemble their cars because they continued to export their auto parts from their domestic factories. And how you always hear me end the show is always try to buy American. I used to say buy American, always buy American. But by the early 2000s, that had to change because it became increasingly difficult to buy something that was actually fully produced in the United States. We think of cars made in the United States today, they are mostly domestic, but not fully domestic because of all the imported parts. So now it's always try to buy American, because sometimes there simply is not an American substitute. And so I just want to repeat it as well, the other important part, that there's a direct relationship between America's international trade deficit and control of U.S. assets by foreign nationals. America's trade deficit represents America's living beyond our means. It means Americans consume more than it produces, spends more than it earns. The excess savings income America uses to consume more than it produces comes from foreign nationals in the forms of capital flow for the U.S. financial assets, businesses, or land. And again, we can identify this pretty easily. We lost control of the U.S. telephone and exchange billing services. We lost control of the U.S. consumer electronics industry, the U.S. photo imaging industry, U.S. luxury goods manufacturing and retailers, U.S. books and magazine publishing industry, U.S. music recording industry, U.S. heavy truck manufacturers, U.S. tire manufacturers, nearly half of U.S. oil and gas companies, large segments of the U.S. food distribution industry, large segments of the U.S. water distribution industry, large segments of the U.S. motion picture industry. We have failed ourselves. The benefits to consumers of the past 50 to 60 years have been real, cheap consumer goods. But there have been costs, the cost to American workers, families, communities, the local, state, and federal budgets. Trade's been dominated by the concept of comparative advantage, as I mentioned before, this idea that nations specialize in goods they have the lowest opportunity costs in producing. But in the era of mobile capital, certainly after the year 2000, comparative advantage is out the window. What we must exercise now is strategic trade theory and the idea of reciprocity. And again, I want to repeat, we have a massive trade deficit in advanced technology, biotechnology, life sciences, optoelectronics, information and communications, electronics, flexible manufacturing, advanced materials, aerospace, weapons, nuclear technology. And so time has come, and President Trump has pulled the trigger. And when we begin to correct these massive imbalances we have in our economy, and by the way, trade imbalance is just one of them, it's going to be painful to make those corrections. Painful for fellow citizens, painful for workers. Just as we try to reduce America's massive budget deficits and debt, it's going to result in job losses. It's going to result in job losses for Republicans and Democrats, for independents and libertarians. There's just no way around it. Anyone that's within the trade sphere, anyone in the export-import world, if they believed in their mind that they could continue going on forever and ever like this, they were stupid. Because eventually something had to be done. It's been threatened to be done for decades. Tariffs are the appropriate response, messy, tough, damaging. And by the way, let's chill out about the stock market. All right? It's been a straight run up for 15 years. NASDAQ is still at 5396. Dow 40,545. Down, yeah. But you know what? Those that have been in the equity market for any part of the last 5 years, you're still up. You're still up. Just take a quick look at the S&P 500 index. And you look at a 5-year chart. 5 years ago, the S&P was trading below 3,000. We're at 5396 today. We're still above levels seen in July. Everyone just chill out about the stock market. It's been a one-way street. It's due for a correction. We're way overbought. It's a massive bubble driven by the Federal Reserve and algorithms. The US dollar, a little bit weaker, but still well within range of the past year. All right, that's all I have for you right now. Always try to buy American.